They were kings in life and brought screams with them into death. Welcome to Viking Valhalla. I'm your host. It's always powerful hearing where you're watching from. Drop a comment and tell me your homeland. You make this legend come alive. Let's uncover it. Beneath the mossed hills and frozen fields of Scandinavia, something ancient breathes without breath. The land rises in quiet humps, unmarked to the unknowing eye, but sacred to those who have come to listen. Time has buried the violence. Centuries of snow have covered the sorrow. But if one kneels in the cold soil and closes their eyes to modern noise, the ship speaks. It does not shout. It sighs. And what it tells is not a tale of conquest or kingship, but one of presence, of ritual, of the intimate way humans once said goodbye. The burial ship is not a vessel of imagination. It was real, hewn from oak and ash, dragged by aching arms across land, then lowered into a pit carved by hands that trembled with reverence or fear. These ships were not placed upon water, but upon earth. They did not carry the living toward new lands, but the dead toward whatever lay beyond sky and stone. The ship beneath the soil was a house, a cradle, a cage. Inside, the deceased lay surrounded by objects that once tethered them to the world: beads, combs, brooches, blades. Gold was rare. What mattered more was memory, familiar tools, a curved knife, a woven cloak still heavy with the smell of fire. But these were not solitary tombs. They were crowded, quiet with breath that had long stopped. The ruler at the center, man or woman, was rarely alone. Laid beside them were the ones who did not choose to die. Slaves, servants, sometimes lovers, sometimes strangers, sometimes animals. The lines between sacrifice and murder blur, as they always do in the dark. Archaeologists have uncovered remains that speak of ritual violence, broken bones, slit throats, the marks of struggle in the dirt. There were women whose teeth were smashed, whose ribs were shattered, whose skulls bore the crack of an axe. They were not always mourned. They were added. For the sake of completeness, to serve in the afterlife, or to complete a narrative written by men who feared the silence of death more than its pain. Science now peers into that soil with gentler eyes. At places like Oseberg, Gokstad, and Salme, excavations have unearthed the remains of ships laid beneath mounds that once towered above fjords. The Oseberg ship, perhaps the most iconic, held 2 women. Nobility, yes, but also mystery. One older, one younger. They were buried with tapestries woven with myth, with carts carved in dragons, with sleighs fit for ice. For decades, the identity of these women was debated. Priestesses, queens, the guardians of sacred rites. Their bones no longer speak clearly, but the wealth that surrounded them suggests power, not just borrowed from men, but wielded in their own right. Still, for every honored burial, there are the quiet horrors. At Salme, 2 ships were discovered filled with over 40 men, most of them warriors. Their skeletons showed signs of violent death: arrows to the skull, blows to the chest. They had been buried carefully, with weapons, with dogs, with pride. But among them were signs of contradiction. Some of the skulls had been placed backward. Some had no weapons at all, and in some Viking burials, the enslaved were beheaded after death. Ritually, perhaps, symbolically, or perhaps just to ensure obedience beyond the grave. What does it mean to bury the unwilling, to tie someone to a leader in death without their consent in life? The sagas are mostly silent. These were not tales told proudly. Even in a culture where death was honored, there were lines too cruel to etch into poetry. But now, soil becomes the only archive. And the soil does not lie. It tells us that beneath the grandeur of the ship burials, the iron nails, the rivets, the splendor, there was grief too wide to name. Some mourned their king, others mourned themselves, and no one was permitted to speak once the earth was placed above them. Even the construction of the ship itself carried meaning. Timber bent to form not just a vessel, but a symbol. Its prow pointed skyward, its ribs curled like the arms of a sleeping god. It was a womb of memory, filled not with life, but with the suggestion of return. Perhaps they believed the ship would sail again, on seas unseen or across the sky. Perhaps they believed the dead would rise again to fight in Ragnarok in that final war. Or perhaps it was simpler. Perhaps they just could not imagine a chieftain lying in a hole like common folk. And yet over time, many ships were forgotten. The mounds collapsed, the wood decayed, the iron rusted to dust. The stories slipped from mouth to mouth, distorted by centuries, until only the archaeologist's brush remained, tracing the outline of a boat that had not moved in 1,000 years. But even now, something lingers. In the graves of Björkum, a child was found buried with a toy boat. Simple, carved, hollow. A child's hope or a parent's dream. In another mound, a woman was buried with a spindle, as though she would spin even in the dark. These were not objects of function. They were symbols of continuity, threads between lives, memory carried into soil, and then there is the silence. The burial mounds do not echo with answers. They do not cry out with history. They hum, they wait, and in that waiting, there is reverence. For beneath the moss, beneath the snow, beneath the crust of centuries, there are people. Real and broken and sacred in their unknowing. Their stories are incomplete as all stories are, but their presence reshapes the way we see the past. Not as myth, not as saga, but as soft human breath, once exhaled, now still. The ship beneath the soil is not just a grave, it is a memory made solid, a silence made heavy, a ritual made permanent. It was the Viking way of refusing to forget, even when forgetting would have been easier, even when forgetting was safer. And as we stand above these mounds now, with machines and gloves and blinking lights, we are the intruders. The soil was never ours. But if we listen softly, if we kneel with humility, we may still hear what they tried to preserve. A farewell not to a hero, but to a world that no longer exists. To a Norse mind, death was not stillness, it was not silence, it was not absence, it was movement, elemental and necessary, like wind through fjord valleys or ice breaking upon the sea. They did not imagine the end as darkness. They saw it as departure, a continuation of rhythm reshaped. Death was not a fall, but a crossing, and that crossing could come in many forms. By blade, by fire, by the swallowing cold of the deep ocean. But it always led somewhere, always. Their world was shaped by story, but their stories were not gentle. The Norse cosmos was woven in 9 threads, each realm suspended over roots and rivers, ash and flame. Midgard for the living, Asgard for gods, Hel for the many, Valhalla for the chosen, and beneath all, Niflheim, a land of ice and silence, older than breath. Death, to them, was not uniform. It had texture, it had destination, and the route depended on how and why you died. Those who fell in battle, whose blood was spilled with courage and chaos, might be claimed by Odin. His hall, Valhalla, was imagined not as a reward, but as a preparation, an eternal training ground for the final battle at the end of days. It was not a paradise. It was a purpose. There, warriors would fight by day, die again, rise again, and feast by night in a hall roofed with shields and echoing with the songs of the Valkyries. To a Viking mind, this was not fantasy. It was architecture, solid, awaiting. But Valhalla was not the only resting place. Freyja, the goddess of fertility and love, also chose from the fallen. Her hall, Folkvanger, was softer, less spoken of but equally honored. Some would go to Hel, a realm ruled by the goddess Hel, half beauty, half bone. This was not punishment, merely continuation. a stillness for those who died of age, of sickness, of sorrow. Not every death needed to be loud to be worthy. Yet regardless of where the soul would go, the body required tending, ritual, precision, respect. And this is where the Norse cosmology of dying becomes less spiritual and more severe, for they believe that the dead must be equipped, not only with goods, weapons, combs, ornaments, food, but with presence, with company, with continuity. A chieftain did not journey alone. A queen did not cross the veil unattended. The soul required not only tools, but attendants. Slaves were not merely property in life. They were passage in death. And so, when a great person died, a war leader, a wealthy merchant, a woman of stature, their household could be summoned to join them, not by invitation, by obligation. Accounts from the Arab traveler Ahmad ibn Fadlan, who witnessed a Russ's funeral, a Norse cultural cousin, speak in chilling detail of what was expected. A slave girl volunteered, or was chosen, to accompany her master. She was dressed, honored, intoxicated, and then she was killed, ritually, brutally, stabbed by priestesses, strangled. Her cries were seen not as resistance, but as the sound of crossing. This was sacred violence, not because it was holy, but because it was structured. There was a rightness to it in the Norse mind, a cosmological symmetry. The dead could not walk alone. They must arrive with echoes. The deeper the grave, the more voices buried. Warriors, thralls, horses, dogs. Anything that bound the deceased to their identity in life must be mirrored in death. Archaeological findings support these layers of ritual. At Birka, the grave of a high-ranking female warrior was found. 2 horses beside her, weapons laid with care. In another mound, the skeletal remains of multiple individuals lay tangled with one another, their cause of death consistent with execution. There are graves where the dead are arranged with arms across chests, peaceful, and others where their limbs are twisted, as though bound or braced. Death did not always arrive with reverence, but it always arrived with order. The Norse did not divide the body from the soul. To them, both were threads in the same weave. A man's axe was part of his spirit. A woman's keys, often buried with her, signified the reach of her presence. When those items were placed beside them in the earth, it was not nostalgia. It was continuity. It was belief. And in some graves, the sheer density of goods, beads strung across ribs, coins placed under tongues, antler combs resting near skulls, speaks of a community trying to say something, not just farewell, but faith. Even fire was a message. In many places, the dead were burned, bones charred, objects fused. Cremation was not erasure. It was release, a letting go by flame. But even here, the rules were not uniform. Some cremations were scattered. Others were placed in urns. Some ship burials were lit aflame and pushed to sea. Though this, while popular in story, is rare in physical record. The fire, the burial, the ritual, all depended on time, on region, on power. But the belief did not waver, because death, to the Norse, was not forgetting. It was transference, a movement of presence from one realm to another. The corpse decayed, the soul departed. But the name remained, and names held power. In the sagas, names echoed. A father's name given to a son, a warrior remembered in a skald's tale, a woman spoken of in hushed reverence long after her spindle stopped spinning. The dead did not disappear. They lingered, in stories, in stones, in customs, and the violence of their passing, while sharp, was seen as necessary. A grief not softened but shaped into ritual, not cruelty, continuity. This was a culture that understood endings not as emptiness, but as movement. Like the sea that surrounded them, ever shifting, ever returning. And so, The dead were not buried to be forgotten. They were sent onward in vessels of wood, in cradles of stone, in flames that reached upward into mist. And those left behind did not close the door. They left it ajar, a place at the table, a name whispered in blessing, a rune carved on a stone. Not in mourning, but in respect. Death, to the Norse, was a bridge. And bridges, in their world, were meant to be crossed. There was no single rite, no codified scroll, no handbook handed from one village to the next, and yet, across generations and across wide stretches of wind and frost, the ritual of accompaniment emerged with a haunting sameness. It was not spoken of lightly. It was not described in sagas with the same glory as battles or feasts, but its evidence lies quiet in the bones and in the earth. To bury a great person was not to close a life. It was to construct a continuation. And in the Norse imagination, no chieftain, no queen, no revered warrior could cross the invisible threshold between the living and the dead alone. Presence demanded presence. A leader's journey into the afterlife required more than provisions and prayer. It required people, and not living ones. Across many burial sites, from Oseberg to Kaupang to Salme, archaeologists have uncovered the signs. Additional bodies, often broken, often younger, laid beside those of the central figure, not wrapped in the same care, not buried with the same intent. Some sprawled, some bound. The story was not always clear in their bones, but the ritual, shaped by silence, speaks anyway. The slave, the servant, the woman whose name never reached the sagas. These were the ones called to accompany. They were not all taken by violence. Some may have gone quietly, even willingly, shaped by a belief that to serve in death was an honor. But many did not. Their deaths were orchestrated, deliberate. And though the method shifted across regions and centuries, the rhythm of the act was consistent. Ahmad ibn Fadlan, a 10th century emissary of the Abbasid Caliphate, witnessed the funeral of a Norse chieftain among the Rus, a people with deep Scandinavian roots. He described the process in unnerving detail. A female slave was chosen to accompany the dead. She was dressed in fine garments, given strong drink, honored by those around her. But beneath the ceremony was certainty. She would die. She was made drunk not out of kindness, but to still the trembling. She was lifted onto the burial platform where ritual priestesses, called the angels of death, took her. One held a rope around her neck. One stabbed her in the ribs. The sounds she made were not resisted. They were accepted. Not as horror, but as harmony. This was the Norse order. A ruler in life must command in death. A king could not walk into the afterlife and carry his own belongings. A queen could not spin fate with unclean hands. They needed bearers, helpers. Continuity made flesh, and that flesh was often unwilling. Still, these acts were not done in shadows. They were public. In many regions, the burial was a communal rite. Mourners gathered, sacrifices performed, the dead arranged with ceremony. The slave's death, brutal as it was folded into the structure of the farewell. It was not hidden. It was sanctioned. Even in some cases, celebrated. For those left behind, the ritual reinforced status. It was proof of wealth, of honor, of divine favor. One did not bury alone unless one had failed to lead. The remains bear this out. In some burial sites, the difference between the honored and the sacrificed is stark. The ruler's body lies surrounded by weapons, jewelry, textiles. Their head cushioned, their limbs arranged. The others lie twisted, sometimes decapitated, sometimes placed at their feet like hunting dogs. In one grave, the sacrificed are headless, their skulls placed elsewhere, as though the very shape of their being had to be reshaped to match the logic of the afterlife. Sometimes the dead were burned, sometimes buried in ships beneath mounds. But the practice of accompaniment moved across both. In some cremation graves, charred bones of multiple individuals mingled together, the ruler indistinguishable from those who screamed their way into death. Fire made no distinction. Only memory did. And memory, in the Norse world, was selective. The sagas do not speak of these deaths with clarity. There are hints, references, shadows, but not stories. The violence was not denied, but neither was it emphasized. It simply was. Like snow, like thunder, like the sea pulling someone under. Even the attire of the sacrificed was structured. The slave girl at a burial might be clothed in silk or linen, adorned in beads, her hair combed, her lips red with berries or blood. This was not meant to ease her passing. It was meant to prepare her arrival. She would stand behind her master in the next realm, just as she had on earth, dressed not for comfort, but for continuity. In some ways, this was not seen as cruelty. It was command, sacred command. The same logic that ordered raiding ships and chieftain councils shaped this final ritual. No one traveled alone. The afterlife was a court, a battlefield, a hall, and a hall must be full. The gods did not want solitude. They wanted structure. But beneath that structure, the echoes persist. The girl who screamed, the man who fought the rope, the child buried at a ruler's feet. These were not just ritual elements. They were people. The Norse world, with all its grandeur and myth, built its endings not only with reverence, but with blood. And the silence that followed was not always peaceful. It was enforced. Modern science approaches this past with caution. DNA analysis, isotopic readings, trauma mapping, they all offer fragments of truth. A broken, rib-a-foreign accent preserved in bone. But the whole story is still buried, and perhaps that is right. For the ritual of accompaniment was never meant to be told in full. It was meant to be obeyed, felt, feared. Still we kneel at these burial sites now, under glass, under rain, under time, and we feel more than we understand. The practice has ended. The dead no longer scream their way into graves behind rulers, but the earth remembers. The soil does not forget the weight of a body dropped without choice. It was not kindness, it was command. And command, in the Viking world, was a law that reached even past the end. The Oseberg mound rises gently from the earth, its shape softened by time and wind, as if the land itself tried to forget what it once held. But beneath that hill, beneath layers of soil and centuries of quiet, a ship lay waiting, not for sale, but for remembrance. Discovered in 1904 near the Oslo fjord, the Oseberg burial ship would become one of the most iconic archaeological finds of the Viking Age. And yet, within all its grandeur, the carved prow, the gilded sleighs, the woven tapestries sealed beneath clay, it was the presence of two women that turned mystery into echo. The first woman, older, powerful, wrapped in fine linen and wool, was likely of noble blood. Her bones showed wear, but also command. A body used, but never used up. She had once walked among the living with presence. Perhaps a queen, perhaps a priestess. Her grave goods were not merely ornamental. They were symbolic. Tools of ritual, fragments of myth, strands of fate caught in embroidery thread and oiled wood. She was not buried with weapons, but with wisdom. The ship itself seemed to tilt around her, as if even in death, the world curved to her shape. But it is the second woman who unsettles the silence. She was younger, possibly in her 20s. Her bones lay close to the elders, as if in service, as if watching. But her body bore signs the first did not. Her teeth were broken, not by accident, but by force. Her face had been struck, her jaw misaligned. There was no elegance in her decay, only interruption. She had not died easily. Her presence in the ship, dressed in similar garments, arranged with similar care, does not smooth over the rupture. Instead, it deepens it. Who was she? a servant, a confidant, a handmaid forced to follow her mistress across the veil? The archaeological record resists conclusion. DNA can only trace blood, not bonds. Isotopes tell of diet and migration, not fear or fidelity. Some scholars once suggested they were mother and daughter, others lovers. Still others believe the younger woman was a ritual sacrifice, chosen or commanded to accompany the elder into death. But beneath speculation is something more permanent, the silence of her bones. She does not speak, but her broken teeth whisper. Unlike other graves where the sacrificed are buried at the feet or laid outside the main chamber, here the two women share space. Intimacy. This suggests a deeper connection, or a more controlled ritual. Perhaps the younger was not simply added. Perhaps she was curated. Killed not in haste, but in ceremony. A servant who served until the very end, or a rival who silenced in a final gesture of dominion. The possibilities swell, but none soothe. The burial goods offer more clues, though they whisper rather than shout. Intricate tapestries, preserved in fragments, depict processions and animal figures. Part mythology, part ritual. A cart carved with intertwining animal motifs. Sleighs polished smooth. Buckets bound in brass. These were not everyday items. They were ceremonial, chosen not for function, but for meaning. The ship itself was not made for the sea. Its hull, while seaworthy, showed no signs of long travel. It was crafted for burial, a cradle for the dead, a container of story. And still, the mystery deepens. No weapons, no coins for passage, no grand feast remains. Instead, textiles, combs, an anchor never used. There is a restraint to this ritual, a narrowing of symbolism, a precision that speaks of status and of control. Someone chose what would go. Someone chose what would be left behind, and that someone ensured that two women, not one, would lie within the ribs of the ship. Modern scientists, historians, and osteologists have all approached the Oseberg site with care and awe. They have carbon dated the wood, studied the pollen in the soil, reconstructed the faces. The ship itself has been displayed, revered, photographed thousands of times. And yet, the younger woman has no name, no saga, no story but the one her injuries tell, and perhaps that is what matters most. For in her stillness, in the hush between her ribs, we hear a kind of truth the rich cannot bury, the truth of obedience. The long breath held by those who do not choose, but are chosen. Her silence is not empty. It is full, weighted, shaped not by peace, but by a fear that outlasted her final breath. The Oseberg burial reminds us that even in a world where death was ritualized, codified, and revered, there were those for whom death arrived not with honor, but with expectation. The great did not descend alone. They brought others with them, in robes or ropes, in song or scream. And while the elder woman remains the focus, the queen, the mistress of ceremonies, it is the younger who lingers longer in the mind. Because her presence was not celebrated, it was assumed. She was part of the plan. A breath made flesh, a life made offering. The Oseberg ship does not drift, it rests, but its story moves, reshaped by each hand that brushes its wood, each scholar who pores over its dust. And in that movement, the mystery remains. Not just who the younger woman was, but why she had to go. Royalty does not always bury alone, and sometimes those buried beside them do not follow. They are taken. In the year 922 of the Common Era, a man named Ahmad ibn Fadlan stood at the edge of a foreign ritual and tried not to flinch. He was no stranger to difference, an emissary of the Abbasid Caliph, sent north from Baghdad into the frost-bound lands of the Volga River. He came not to convert or conquer, but to witness, to observe, to carry news of strange customs home to the courts of his empire. What he found among the Norse, the Rus as they were known to him, did not leave him. It clung to the edges of his memory and, later, to his ink. The Rus were Scandinavian traders and warriors settled along the rivers of what is now Russia. They dressed in bright cloth, combed their hair daily, adorned themselves with silver rings and elaborate beads. They believed in spirits and in fate, in death and in what came after. They built ships not only to cross water, but to cross worlds. And when one of their own, a wealthy chieftain, died, they prepared a ritual that would ensure his soul would not walk alone. Fadlan was present, not hidden, not guessing. He stood close enough to see. And what he saw, he wrote down. The dead man had been laid into a temporary grave, not yet his final resting place. The community waited 10 days. During that time, preparations began for his true burial. A ship was pulled ashore and readied. Goods were gathered: textiles, bread, weapons, fermented drinks, fruit, and animals. Horses would die for him. Dogs would die for him, and so would one of his slaves. A girl was chosen. Whether she volunteered, or whether she was chosen for her silence, is unclear. She reportedly consented. But within a world that gave her no other path, what does consent mean? Fadlan, steeped in his own culture, watched with revulsion and sorrow, but he did not turn away, and because of him, this ritual, which would have otherwise passed into dust and ash, was recorded, preserved. The girl was paraded. She was made to drink repeatedly. She entered tents and was offered comfort or distraction or sedation. Then, in front of the elders, she was raped by the dead man's relatives and by a ritual priestess, a woman known as the Angel of Death. This act was not considered violence in their eyes. It was ceremony, the sealing of her fate, her final submission. She was dressed in finery, silks, beads, jewelry. She was given a small dagger. She sang. She drank again. Her feet stumbled, and then she was lifted into the burial ship and placed beside her master. The priestess approached. The men formed a circle, and with practiced hands, the woman of death performed her role. She wrapped the rope. She struck with the blade. Fadlan wrote that the girl cried out, a long sound, high and sudden, and then was still. There was no moment of collective grief, no hush of mourning, only fire. The ship, filled with all the items that marked this man's wealth and presence, was set ablaze. Furs, fruit, animals, weapons, the man, the girl, all burned. The flames rose toward the overcast sky, the crackle of timber, the hiss of skin, her scream lost in the roar of combustion. This was not considered cruelty by those who performed it. It was a rite, sacred, exacting, necessary. In their cosmology, the dead must be sent off fully equipped, not just with tools, but with loyalty, with service, with presence. The girl had been part of his household. She would be part of his afterlife, but Fadlan did not write it as rite. He wrote it as rupture. His words, preserved in his travel writings, are filled with horror. He does not mask his disgust. He saw a human being consumed not only by flame, but by expectation. The logic of the ritual could not be divorced from the logic of power. She had said yes, because no was not a word that held weight for her. Her life had been given to another in every possible way, first in work, then in death. And through Fadlan, the silence split open. Had he not been there, this ritual would have faded into legend, unverified, unspoken. Archaeologists might have guessed, historians might have wondered, but the precision of his record pierces the centuries. It reminds us that death in the Viking world was not just mythic. It was real, it was structured, it was shared, sometimes unwillingly. Today, we sift the ash of those ancient fires. We study the burnt bones found in river valleys. We run tests, carbon dates, isotopic analyses. But none of those can capture the sound of that scream. Only Fadlan could, and he did. The ritual he witnessed was not unique to the Rus. Traces of similar practices exist across Scandinavia, from mound burials to ship graves. Though not always this violent, the core idea held that the dead must be accompanied. That power in life extended into death. That service never ended. The slave girl is unnamed. Her face is lost, her blood mixed with ash. But her story survives, not because her own people remembered her, but because a foreign diplomat, appalled and alert, held his pen steady. She was not mourned, she was used, but now, through the cracks in time, she is seen. And sometimes, that is the first kindness history gives. They called her the Angel of Death, not in fear, but in function, a woman of ritual, a priestess wrapped in dark certainty and silent purpose. She wore iron jewelry that clinked softly when she moved, and her voice carried the weight of command. To the Norse, death required structure, ceremony, witness, and she was its architect, its vessel. It was she who prepared the slave girl, she who guided her from one world to the next. The girl had been chosen, or she had offered, or she had simply known, as those in her place always did, that resistance was not a language anyone would listen to. She was young, likely no more than 16 or 17. The sagas do not name her. The burial chants did not include her, but she became part of the story anyway. Not in honor, but in inevitability. For 6 days, she was cared for. Or rather, she was managed, made to drink fermented drinks that dulled the edges of what waited, led from tent to tent, bathed in ritual waters, given food, dates, nuts, bread still warm from the fire. She was clothed in fine garments, her wrists adorned with beads she never owned. Her hair was braided by women who looked away as they worked. All of this was part of the ritual, a soft numbing of flesh before its undoing. The Angel of Death watched over it all. She was neither cruel nor kind. She did not shout, she instructed, moved with purpose, arranged each gesture like a performance too ancient to question. This was her role, as vital to the community as the smith or the skald. Without her, the transition between life and afterlife would remain incomplete. The master, already lying in his burial ship, could not begin his journey until she ensured it would be done properly. And so, on the 7th day, they led the girl to the black tent. It stood not far from the ship. Its fabric sagged slightly, weighed by damp air. It was not decorative. It was not a shrine. It was a chamber of passage, a space not meant for the living or the dead, but for the movement between the two. Inside, it was dark. No torches burned. Only the scent of blood and incense hung in the air, thick and waiting. She was drawn in, slowly, her legs unsure. The alcohol made her pliant. Not unaware, but unable to resist with full force. Inside, men waited. Not strangers, but members of the community. Elders, warriors, witnesses, participants. They helped hold her down. Ritual required not only killing, but control. Each part of her death was deliberate. Outside, the drums began. Low, rhythmic, a steady beat against the cold earth. Not festive, not frantic. Just enough to mask what might be heard, to soften the cries that would otherwise carry, to make the screams part of the ritual, but not the memory. Inside, the Angel of Death moved with care. She had done this before. She knew where to place the rope, where to press the blade, how to read the moment when breath ceased. This was not violence for its own sake. It was structured, final. It was a task to be done cleanly, efficiently, though never gently. The black tent became a coffin before the pyre. The girl's body, now still, was wrapped and carried, not as a corpse, but as an offering. She would not be buried in earth. She would not lie beneath stone. Her body would be placed beside her master, in the ship already filled with goods, with horses, with other sacrifices. She would lie among them, decorated, dressed, dead. And then came the fire. The ship was set ablaze. Timber, rope, flesh, all caught flame together. The wind shifted, and the smoke turned inward, swallowing itself. The flames became her last dress, rising from her ankles to her shoulders, curling through her hair like hands that no longer needed permission. There was no mourning, only watching. The people gathered did not weep. They observed. They stood in order. They allowed the fire to complete what the tent had begun. No words were spoken over her. No songs were sung in her name. The master received the ritual. She was the ritual. And yet through all this, something lingers, a presence the fire could not consume. In Fadlan's writing, in the memory of those who dig into the earth now, in the outlines of fingernails embedded into burial planks, in the silence that always surrounds ritual, too cruel to describe. The angel of death, for all her certainty, did not survive in memory either. Her name was not passed down, her role dissolved when the rite was no longer needed, but her function left a shape. One repeated across graves, across stories told only in whispers, across centuries that forgot the details but remembered the pattern. Today, we peer into these rituals not to judge them with modern eyes, but to understand what they reveal. A society that wove death into meaning with deliberate hands, that viewed control, even unto the last breath, as sacred, that masked violence in reverence and silence in structure. The girl is gone. The tent is long collapsed. The fire is ash. But in the spaces where no names remain, we still feel the tension between command and consent, between ritual and cruelty, between presence and loss. There are deaths too quiet for the sagas. No skald sang them, no elder told them by the fire. These were not deaths for the hall or the battlefield. They were not framed in glory, nor remembered with carved stone. These were deaths beneath timbers, beneath stones, beneath earth that did not wait for breath to stop before it covered the body. Some were buried while still breathing. This is not speculation born from cruelty. It is suspicion drawn from the bones, from collapsed rib cages with no blade nearby, from limbs bent backwards, twisted as if in a final spasm, from teeth clenched around fragments of soil, not laid in the mouth, but dragged in with a last desperate inhale. These are not wounds of battle. These are not the marks of combat or accident. They are signs of ritual. They are markers of silence obeyed too deeply. Not every slave or servant who followed their master into the grave died by fire or blade. The stories told of strangling, stabbing, sacrifice in tents. But the bones whisper what the stories won't say, that some were placed in the ground alive, covered with timbers, weighted with stone, lowered into ships and buried in haste or ceremony, and left there, breathing, hoping, fading. There is no written record of this practice. No eyewitness like Fadlan stood close enough or dared to tell it. But archaeologists now find graves that suggest it. Secondary skeletons in burial chambers, not arranged with care, but trapped in corners, sprawled awkwardly. Chests crushed not by weapons, but by pressure. Hands near the face, as if shielding against falling earth. These details do not belong to the honored dead. They belong to the forgotten, obedient. At Kaupang and Birka, at Gokstad and Gjermundbu, excavators have uncovered bones that refuse to lie cleanly. Not every burial tells this story, but enough do that the pattern emerges. Not proven, not declared, but felt. A possibility that cannot be dismissed. Why would they do this? The answer lies in belief. In the Norse world, death was not only the end of a body. It was the reshaping of presence. A chieftain could not be alone in the next realm. His hall needed servants, his animals, his memories. And if the ritual demanded haste, If there was no time or no will for more active killing, the burial became the method. To leave the living in the tomb was not seen as a betrayal, it was seen as completion. The breath was not sacred. The structure was, and yet the fear remains, buried with them. It lives in the fractures, in the tension of joints pulled too far, in the soft outlines of fingernails torn against the grain of wooden planks. This was not sleep. This was panic, muffled by soil. And still, they did not shout. Or if they did, it was under the weight of ritual, the weight of knowing no one would come. This kind of death was not spectacle. There were no drums, no chants, no flames. Only the sound of shovels, the slow drop of earth, the pressure of a command followed to the last inhale. These were not slaves who struggled. They were slaves who obeyed, and the obedience was total. In one grave in Denmark, the skeleton of a young girl was found curled beneath the platform of the burial chamber. Not placed, dropped. Her legs bent beneath her as if she had tried to sit up once, then could not. Her jaw slightly dislocated, soil packed deep between her ribs. No blade touched her, no sign of strangulation. But she died there, and she died during the burial, not before. The chamber was sealed above her, and the memory sealed with it. Modern scientists proceed carefully. These signs are not easy to declare. Soil shifts, bones move. Time hides its traces well, but when patterns emerge, when the same quiet shapes repeat across regions and generations, we are forced to ask what kind of world allowed this. Not in cruelty, but in control. Not in rage, but in ritual. It is tempting to look away, to frame the Viking world in swords and sails, in myths and firelight, to focus on the drama of kingship, the noise of battle, the honor of death. But beneath all that noise is the hush of the silent ones. Those who did not scream because no one would listen. Those who did not run because there was nowhere to run to. Those who did not matter except as part of someone else's ending. Their deaths are not myths. They are evidence, and evidence in its stillness can speak louder than story. So now, when we stand above a burial mound, whether in Sweden or Norway or the edges of Estonia, we must remember who lies beneath, not just the honored, not just the named, but those who watched the sky disappear through cracks in the wood, who felt the final weight settle on their chest, who breathed soil and said nothing. They were not remembered, but they are not entirely forgotten. They are the hush beneath the saga, the silence beneath the flame, and they remind us that obedience in the wrong hands can be more terrifying than war. Among the Norse elite, power was not measured only in silver or swordsmanship. It was not solely in the ships they built or the halls they feasted in. True power, the kind that outlasted seasons, that echoed into myth, was shown in control over life and death, not only one's own, but others. And for Viking royalty, there was no clearer expression of that control than the bodies buried beside them. Slaves in the Viking world were not merely workers. They were symbols of wealth, yes, but more deeply of ownership, the ability to command a life and to end it. They were laborers in the field, caretakers in the home, bearers of lineage through forced motherhood. But in death, they became capital of a different kind. Ritual capital. Status made visible through suffering. To own another person was already a statement. But to end that person, to pull them into death as part of a funeral rite, that was something more. It was a declaration that one's dominion did not end at the grave, that even in death, a king or queen did not walk alone. Their legacy was not abstract. It was breathing, bleeding, and silenced beside them. This belief found its ultimate form in royal burials. The more elaborate the tomb, the more extravagant the ritual, the more bodies it held. the higher the standing of the deceased. A nobleman buried with a sword and coins was expected. A chieftain buried with horses and fine textiles showed strength, but a ruler buried with servants, concubines, and guards, sacrificed or entombed, showed dominion that transcended life itself. The more pain evident in the grave, the greater the prestige it conveyed. This was not shameful in their eyes. It was sacred, ordered. The gods were watching, Odin, Freyja, Hel, and the message was clear. I ruled in life, and I rule in death. The living mourned, but not always with sorrow. Their grief, in part, was proof of the dead's importance. A painful loss was a public signal, and the more devastating the procession, the more lasting the memory. Mourning became performance. Pain became power. Archaeological sites confirm this. At Vendel and Valsgärde, warrior graves hold not just weapons, but sacrificed retainers. At Salme, over 40 warriors lie together, their bodies arranged, their wounds still telling of organized death. At Oseberg, the possible presence of a ritual companion, her face broken, her purpose unclear, suggests a death not for self, but for show. To the Norse, these burials were not acts of cruelty. They were statements. A dead king who brought others with him had not lost his grip. He had extended it. And in a world where loyalty was shaped by fear as much as by affection, this mattered. One's afterlife was expected to mirror one's life. And a king who arrived in the next world alone would have seemed to his people incomplete. So slaves became more than workers. They became currency of remembrance. The grief their deaths inflicted on others, their families, their companions, even their own unseen dreams, was never calculated. Their pain was not counted, only their presence. To be buried beside royalty was not a reward. It was an erasure. It meant your body would be arranged as part of someone else's glory. Your bones would be studied centuries later, not for who you were, but for who you served. Yet the system held firm, because it affirmed the hierarchy of all things, man above man, woman beneath master, slave beneath soil. In such a world, ownership was not simply economic, it was spiritual. To end a life in one's name was to prove that the gods themselves endorsed your authority. In this way, pain became performance, and performance became prestige. The grief displayed at royal funerals was not just genuine emotion, it was symbolic proof. It said, this was a person of worth. Look what was given up for him, look what was sacrificed with her, and when pain is wielded as proof, it leaves behind a grave not just full of memory, but full of warning. The message was as much for the living as for the divine. A man who could take others with him into death was a man who had ruled completely. A woman who died surrounded by attendants proved her dominion extended past breath. And those buried beneath them, around them, or with them, told the world without speaking, this was someone who did not die alone, because no one dared let them. In the stillness of these graves today, we see not only bones and objects, but the cold geometry of command. Each body laid down like punctuation at the end of a sentence the ruler dictated. Each rib cracked, not by accident, but by intention. Each silence shaped not by peace, but by hierarchy. The royal standard of ownership was not a banner. It was a body, sometimes several. And in that body, cold and curled, is the unspoken line that divided the powerful from the expendable. And that line, once crossed, left no return. It is tempting to believe that power softens when it belongs to a woman, that the hand that spins thread or rocks a cradle could not also command death. But the Viking world, in all its wildness and ceremony, did not separate rule from ruthlessness, no matter who bore the title. Power was power. And Viking queens, like their male counterparts, did not go alone into the afterlife. Their graves tell this story, quiet but undeniable. Mounds that rise like breaths long held. Ships that once floated on the living sea, now anchored forever in soil. And within them, alongside silks, brooches, woven tapestries, and polished combs, are the bones of others, other women, other lives. Queens were buried in grandeur. This much is known. They were sent into death with care, with pageantry. Their hair was combed, their garments layered in linen and fine imported silks dyed in distant lands. Their burial ships, like Oseberg's, were carved with fierce beauty, not only signs of wealth, but signs of wisdom, leadership, and sacred connection to gods or ancestors. A Viking queen was not a decoration. She was often a figure of immense influence, politically, ritually, domestically. But that power came wrapped in the same expectations that surrounded kings: control, legacy, and the extension of authority beyond death. And so, just as men were accompanied into the grave by those who had served them in life, so too were women of rank. They were not alone. Others went with them: concubines, slaves, handmaidens. Some perhaps volunteered, some perhaps were chosen, but many were given, offered, or ordered, to serve, not only in the mead hall or the weaving house, but forever in the shadows of death. In the Oseberg ship burial, we find two women, one clearly royal, her remains arranged, honored, encircled with priceless artifacts. The other, younger, injured, uncelebrated. Was she a slave, a servant, a companion? Her identity remains hidden, but her presence is unmissable. And so it was in other burials, where bodies were not laid out but curled, cramped, forgotten in corners, their postures unnatural. Not peace, but pressure. These were not deaths from age or illness. These were chosen dead, but not by themselves. The queen's journey to the afterlife required attendants, even in myth. In life, she may have governed a household of dozens. In death, she was expected to maintain that dignity, that presence, that structure. Her burial ship became a floating court, and every ruler needs a retinue. Every matriarch needs a memory of her domain, even if it breathed through the lungs of someone who begged not to follow. Women were often the unseen core of Viking society, raising children, maintaining farms, preserving memory through song and stitch. But among them were women who bore none of that praise, women who served without reward, whose lives were shaped entirely by the whims of another. And in death, that service did not end. Some were concubines, taken during raids or given as gifts between chieftains. Others were enslaved women, ripped from Baltic shores or captured in Irish hills. They wove the fabrics the queen wore. They lit the fires she warmed herself by. They combed her hair in the morning, and when she died, they were draped beside her. To be selected for this passage was not honor, it was erasure. The sagas are nearly silent on this. They praise queens for wisdom, for prophecy, for boldness, but they do not name those who died at their feet. There is no saga for the woman with soil in her teeth, no story for the handmaiden laid between timbers, her wrists bound beneath her silk sleeves, and yet their bones remain. In tombs once sealed with earth and reverence, archaeologists now uncover not just artifacts, but hierarchies. Grave after grave shows the same pattern, a central figure surrounded by those who had no saga, and beneath every display of wealth is a cost unspoken, a body unclaimed. Modern science helps us read what the old texts do not say. Osteological studies trace trauma. Soil composition reveals hurried burials, hasty construction. DNA shows that not all buried together were kin. Some were foreign, some were outsiders. All were chosen for their stillness. These women, the silent ones, the carried ones, they were the bricks of legacy. They were the scaffolding of a queen's memory. Her journey to the afterlife was not just a matter of faith. It was performance, pageantry, structure. And to die beside her was not to share in her greatness. but to be consumed by it. To serve was not just for life, it was for eternity. The queen's death was a mirror of her life. Ordered, attended, controlled. Her burial told her people, here lies not just a woman, but a force. A figure who ruled the domestic sphere so completely that even death obeyed her. And if others had to die for that message to be made clear, then so be it. Their names are gone. Their stories were not written. But the stillness they were forced into remains. It remains in the graves. It remains in the silence. And now, centuries later, it begins to be heard. Bones forget slowly. They do not speak in sentences or song. They speak in fragments, in angles, in the small betrayals of a shoulder displaced or a rib that caved too soon. They speak when all other voices are gone. And for the archaeologist, the bone becomes the last witness. Silent, patient, reluctant to yield its truth, but unable to hide it completely. In the world of Viking death, much was recorded in earth rather than ink. Stories were told in soil strata and wood grain, in the pattern of iron rivets buried in forgotten ships. But it is the skeletal record that speaks loudest now, not in sound, but in presence. A femur turned inward, a jaw with teeth clenched around soil, a wrist bent back in a way no rest could create. Many Viking remains show the visible signatures of violence. Blade marks across ribs, cracks along skulls, clean punctures that align with known weapons. These are not surprising in a culture that honored war and believed in sacred death. But what is more revealing are the wounds that are not so clear, the ones that show no bloodletting, no warrior's end, no song. Because absence of injury is not absence of violence. The skeletal record reminds us that silence is also a kind of scream. One buried so deeply, it can only be heard through slow attention and careful hands. A woman buried curled at the foot of a ship, her bones pressed against the planks as if she had not been placed, but left. A child with limbs splayed at unnatural angles, no sign of weapon, but posture that suggests panic, not peace. A man with his wrists folded unnaturally beneath his torso, as if bound behind his back before death. These are not scenes of ceremony. They are remnants of submission. Archaeologists now know to look beyond the blade. They read death not just through wounds, but through position. Proximity, who lies beside whom, how they were laid, whether they were arranged or discarded or trapped, whether they were honored or used. A woman placed beside a chieftain with no goods of her own, no brooch, no comb, only her body, positioned as if she were watching him even in death. A man laid at the threshold of a tomb, not inside, but not outside either, a guardian or a warning, or simply in the way. Children buried two at a time, with no grave goods, no names, and no markers. Sometimes trauma is microscopic. A fractured hyoid bone, suggesting strangulation. Sometimes it's in the soil itself, compacted tightly over the chest, pressing the ribs inward. Sometimes it's the way the skull sits at a distance from the spine, quiet dislocations that do not come from sleep. These are not tales sung by skalds. They are truths whispered by bodies no longer able to run. In high-status graves, we see patterns emerge. The ruler placed with intention, surrounded by objects of beauty and strength. And then the others. Beside, beneath, around. Less adorned, sometimes broken, always still. This is not accidental. This is a language. Burial positioning tells stories. It tells us who mattered, who followed, who was chosen. Not to be remembered, but to be silenced. Even in the most celebrated Viking sites, Oseberg, Gokstad, Salme, the secondary bodies complicate the tale. They remind us that ritual was often built atop submission, that sacredness could be shaped from someone else's absence. The archaeologist must learn to listen not just to what is there, but to what is missing. A grave with no wound might still tell of a death interrupted. A burial with no name might still mark a life taken. The silence in the skeletal record is not a gap. It is a presence that demands reverence. We cannot always say who they were. Their stories were not carved, their names were not passed down, but their bones remain. And bones, when read with humility, speak louder than myth. They speak of a world that used the body to measure worth, that placed people in the ground not always to honor, but to maintain order. A world where silence was not peace, but power. And now, as we lift these remains into the light of a new century, we must listen, not only to what they tell us, but to what they were never allowed to say. The longship was never just a vessel. It was a stage, a coffin, a monument carved in timber and intention. Its prow rose like the head of a serpent, its ribs curved like the bones of some ancient beast. But beneath its elegance lay something colder, a precision not for travel, but for legacy. When the Vikings laid their dead into ships, they were not setting them free. They were fixing them in time. These were not ships that crossed the waves, not anymore. They were pulled ashore, dragged into shallow graves, or raised on high mounds of earth and stone. Some were burned, others buried whole. But all of them were transformed, no longer tools of movement. They became declarations of wealth, of dominion, of a death so important that even wood must bend to honor it. The longship held more than bodies. It held hierarchy, and those laid within were never alone. The royal or noble dead, a chieftain, a queen, a war leader, was placed with care. Cushioned in furs, wrapped in linen, their tools and treasures arranged around them, swords that had killed, cloaks that had warmed, keys that had commanded. But they were not the only ones lowered into that hold. Others came too. A servant girl curled beside the bedpost, a warrior lying without armor, a handmaid with her wrists bound beneath her sleeves, horses, their necks slashed, dogs curled in eternal obedience. Each addition was not merely practical, it was performative. It said, this death mattered. This person was followed, even into flame, and the flame was always waiting. In many burials, the longship was not left to rot in earth. It was burned, consumed in ritual fire that reached upward in smoke, the way memory does. The dead were not sailing seas, but myth. The fire was not cremation alone. It was spectacle, a final scene. The onlookers watched the ship catch. They saw the timber blacken, the cloaks curl, the hair turn to ash. They heard the horses scream once, and then not again. The ship creaked as it gave way, collapsing in upon itself like a stage at the end of a performance no one would ever repeat. What was left was not grief. It was proof, because the ship did not just carry the dead. It carried a story of how much the deceased had meant, how many lives they had owned, how far their shadow stretched. It was a moving equation. How many bodies burned beside you determined the weight of your legacy. Those others, the slaves, the attendants, the sacrificed, were not seen as passengers. They were signals. Their presence was not accompaniment, it was punctuation. Their stillness screamed what words would not. This was someone who ruled. The ship then became a sentence, a final statement about power, written not in runes, but in bodies. To the Norse, this was not cruelty, it was continuation. The dead needed their world preserved around them, tools to hunt with, mouths to speak to, hands to serve. And so the ship was built not only of oak and iron, but of people, living once, then still. Some of these ships were never meant to touch water again. Their hulls were shaped to lie flat in the soil, their keels never tested against wave or tide. They were always meant to rest, the long sleep, a death so absolute even the sea was kept away, and yet the symbolism of the ship remained. It was the vessel of crossing. From life into myth, from body into smoke, from command into memory. At places like Oseberg and Gokstad, the grandeur is preserved in museum glass. Tourists marvel at the carvings, the symmetry, the craftsmanship, but beneath the beauty is something harder, the recognition that these were not gentle graves. They were orchestrated, they were rehearsed, and they were built upon the backs of others. Modern science walks carefully now, sifting ash and soil, reading the record of ribs, the angle of the jaw. We know that some buried in these ships were not dead when they were placed inside, that the silence was not always peaceful, and we know that the power these ships proclaimed was not kind. It was final. Because the longship in death was not transportation, it was testimony. It carried no wind in its sails, only smoke. It launched no voyage, only memory. And those burned beside the ruler did not join the journey. They made the journey real, made it seen, made it terrifying. In that fire, in that silence, in that last burst of heat and shadow, power became something permanent. The longship bore the dead, but it did not carry them alone. It carried every life they had controlled, every name they had silenced, every body they had made proof. Some bones bear runes, etched into the surface with precision, a single stroke of iron along femur or rib. Not decoration, but declaration. A name, a curse, a purpose spoken into silence. Elsewhere, on the same body or another, the rusted imprint of shackles circles the wrist or ankle. An iron ring, once closed tightly, now eaten by time. Together, these markings, the rune and the chain, do not oppose. They complete. The Viking world did not divide power cleanly. It did not need to. The sacred and the enslaved could occupy the same space, the same breath. They could kneel side by side at the same hearth, or be buried together beneath the same mound. And in death, that blurred logic did not dissolve. It hardened, became ritual, became structure. To carve a rune into bone was not casual. It was an act of permanence, a signature, a symbol that followed the soul wherever it went. Some scholars believe it was meant to bless, others to bind. A woman buried beside her mistress might bear a rune on her scapula. Not her own name, but a phrase. Belongs to Helga, follows in fire. Not ownership inscribed in law, but in body. And then the shackles. Some remain intact, corroded into the form of the wrist they once clasped. Others left only faint discoloration, a memory of iron. They were not always locked in life. Sometimes they were added in death. A final gesture, a reminder, a message to the gods. This soul arrives as property, not peer. And yet, the same wrist might wear gold. The same body bathed, robed, and perfumed before burial. This was not contradiction. It was ritual, truth. A servant could be honored, dressed in silk, fed from carved bowls, sung to as she was led to her death. And still be chained, still be denied choice, still be made proof of another's status. The Norse did not see this as hypocrisy. They saw it as hierarchy. The afterlife mirrored the world they knew, stratified, layered, etched with obligation, honor above, horror beneath. Their cosmology held 9 realms, threaded together by the roots of Yggdrasil. But not all souls ascended equally. The warrior slain in battle, blade in hand, might feast in Valhalla. The servant buried alive beneath her master might enter hell, quiet and cold. Or she might follow him, not as herself, but as extension. Not a guest in the hall, but a hand pouring mead forever. The runes on bone were not always legible. Time fades language, but they remain powerful. A line etched into ribcage still holds weight, not because we can read it, but because someone needed it to be read. By the gods, by the next world, by time. Modern science traces these contradictions gently. CT scans of skeletons reveal fractures, not from accidents, but from bindings, tiny grooves on bone that match shackles or the edge of a blade. Historians speak carefully, unsure whether a rune was a blessing or a brand. But the duality is clear: to be both adorned and enslaved, to be both honored and used, to be remembered, but not for oneself. In the Viking imagination, this duality was not discomforting. It was order. The world required servants in life, and so the afterlife must require them too. The queen did not enter alone. She brought attendants. The war leader was not buried in silence. He was sung to, fed, surrounded, not just by things, but by people made into things. Bones bear witness. The runes are their voice, the shackles their history. And as we lift these bones from the soil, lay them beneath sterile light, scan them for meaning, they speak, not in full stories, but in truths etched deeper than myth. The Viking world did not flinch from complexity. It built its afterlife from it. And so, we must remember, power was not clean, faith was not gentle, and memory, when carved into bone, does not fade. Ritual needed a hand, a gesture to begin, a voice to direct, a presence to sanctify the unspeakable, and in many graves, that hand was female. She was the vulva, the seeress, the priestess, the one who stood between what was living and what was not. Her body, wrapped in wool and bones, walked the edge of two worlds. She did not rule like a queen, nor fight like a warrior. But when it came time for the dead to pass, and for others to follow them, it was her voice that mattered most. She was not feared because she killed. She was feared because she decided. The vulva was a sacred figure in Viking life and a shadowed one. She was not common. She arrived when needed, summoned, respected, and held at a distance. She carried with her a staff, often tipped in iron or wound with rings. She wore brooches heavy with age, pendants shaped like keys, birds, or beasts. She spoke in chants, in breathy syllables, meant not for ears, but for what lies beyond hearing. When a person of power died, a chieftain, a queen, a warrior beloved or feared, the vulva was called, not to grieve, but to arrange. She did not merely tend to the body. She tended to the balance. Who would go with the dead? Who was required to make the journey whole? This was not left to family or chance. It was ritual, and ritual needed order. The vulva gave it. She used herbs to dull the senses, to soften resistance. She used chants to lull, to bless, or to bind. And when the time came, she used knives. In some burials, the presence of a ritual execution is clear, not just from wounds, but from the structure of the act. The girl dressed in silk, the circle of men, the tent darkened. At the center stood the priestess, not covered in blood, but steady. She did not strike in frenzy, she performed. The blade was part of the script. The silence that followed was the desired outcome. The vulva was not a murderer. She was a midwife, to the dead and to the death of others. In this role, she held more than power. She held certainty. The community accepted her judgment, feared it, depended on it. If she said a slave must follow the master, the command was not questioned. If she named a horse or a child or a handmaiden, it was done. Not out of cruelty, but continuity. To the Norse, death was structure. A journey needed order. The dead required attendance. The gods watched. The vulva ensured that the offering was correct, that the transition was clean, that no soul wandered where it did not belong. She understood the gods, or claimed to. Odin, who gathered warriors for the end of days. Freyja, who welcomed the fallen. Hel, who received those who died without drama. But it was not only the gods who listened to her, it was the living. Even in life, the vulva was treated with caution. She could predict storms, trace fates, name hidden truths. In the sagas, she is both revered and isolated. Invited to the hall, but not seated among kin. Asked to speak, but not touched. Her insight was necessary. Her presence was unsettling. She embodied the ambiguity that the Viking world so often accepted. A woman with the power to choose in a society built on hierarchy. She was not of the elite, but she moved among them. Her decisions altered legacies. Her hands ended lives, and yet her own death rarely leaves a mark. Few graves are clearly hers. Some have been speculated, women buried with staffs, herbs, seers' tools. But none speak loudly. Perhaps that too is fitting. Her power was never in spectacle. It was in the final whisper before the grave was sealed. In many ship burials, where others lie arranged in obedience, her presence is felt even when unseen. The logic of the ritual, the balance, the symmetry, the silence, is hers. She is the breath that shaped the ending, the unseen voice behind the stillness, and in that she remains terrifying. Because to kill in a frenzy is human, but to choose, to orchestrate, to fold death into ceremony, that is power most unsettling. The vulva was not the hand that trembled. She was the hand that knew. She was not feared because she killed. She was feared because she decided. Why did the slaves comply? Why did they step forward when summoned, hands open, voices quiet? Why did they walk, dressed in borrowed silk and crowned with borrowed braids, toward the tent they would never leave? Because to refuse was worse than to die. In the Viking world, hierarchy was not simply enforced. It was believed. It was breathed. A slave did not merely serve. They were shaped. From the moment they were taken, in raids along Baltic coasts, from Irish villages, from the ruins of rival clans, or born into captivity, cradled by mothers who themselves were not free. They were raised not to ask, but to obey. Their world was not one of choice. It was one of expectation, repeated until it became law beneath the skin. To disobey meant punishment, and punishment was not small. A slave could be beaten, branded, maimed, killed without consequence. A refusal to enter the grave might not spare them. It might only make their death slower, crueler, public. So they complied, because they were made to believe there was no other path, because they were drunk or drugged. The ritual demanded stillness, and stillness is easiest when the will is softened. Fermented mare's milk, strong mead, herbs steeped in bitter water, given not as kindness, but as sedation. Slaves were made ready for death not by words, but by substances that dulled resistance. Their minds clouded, their limbs loosened. They stumbled where once they might have run. Some were young, barely women, barely men. They had known no world beyond obedience, no life beyond being owned. To die at their master's feet was not a betrayal of dreams. They had never been taught to dream, and some, a few, believed. Believed that to serve in the afterlife was better than to be forgotten, that loyalty might be rewarded, that they might be seen finally by the gods. There are stories, rare and fragmentary, of the willing, of the girl who raised her hand, of the man who said yes. But even these tales are clouded, told by those who stood above, not beside, who had the right to speak, while the sacrificed did not. And behind it all, the tent. The black tent stood waiting, outside the burial ship, close enough for its shadow to touch the boards. Inside it, the drums, the priestess, the blade. Everyone knew what happened there, but no one named it. Not aloud. It was the space where the ritual became irreversible, and the fear of it was thick. The tent was not feared for what it held, but for what it proved. That the end would come, no matter the will. That death was not something you met, but something that took. Slowly or swiftly, but without pause. The priestess inside the tent, the vulva or angel. Of death, was not cruel in the way a jailer is cruel. She did not curse. She did not shout. Her power was in how calmly she spoke, how efficiently she moved. She carried the blade not like a weapon, but like a tool, and she did not waver. That was what terrified them. To stand in front of her was to know that nothing could be pleaded, nothing could be undone. Some may have cried, some may have whispered final words. Most were quiet, not from acceptance, but from exhaustion, from generations of obedience so deep it no longer needed force. It had become muscle memory, a nod, a step forward, a silence that sealed their fate. Their names were not recorded, their thoughts were not preserved, but their fear survives in the tension of their remains, in the way their spines curved, in the soil clutched in their teeth, in the wrist bent too far, the rib cracked, not by blow, but by pressure. Signs of struggle swallowed into ritual. They complied because refusal was unthinkable. They complied because obedience was survival, until it wasn't. And they are remembered not for who they were, but for who they served. Their bones lie beside royalty, beneath ships and stones. Not honored, not mourned, just used. But now the question rises again, not from them, but for them. Why did they comply? Because no one was ever meant to ask. These killings were not for cruelty, not in the way cruelty is often understood, as punishment, as vengeance, as bloodlust. They were not born from rage, nor driven by impulse. They were planned, measured, performed beneath sky and stone as offerings. To kill a servant at the grave of a master was not, to the Norse, an act of savagery. It was an act of structure, a message sent not to the living, but to the divine. Because sacrifice, they believed, meant favor, and favor meant life. Crops that rose green from black soil, battles won before the blade struck, winters survived with food enough, children born strong and breathing. These things were never taken for granted. In a world where death was always near, in illness, in childbirth, in storm, in war, the gods had to be pleased, appeased, convinced. So when someone of stature died, the ritual did not end with their last breath. It expanded, it reached outward, drawing others in. Servants, slaves, horses, dogs. They were chosen not for who they were, but for what their deaths could signify. They were tokens, not cheap, but necessary. The master could not arrive empty-handed before the gods. To nourish fate, something had to be given. Sometimes it was blood spilled into soil. Sometimes it was fire sent skyward in a pyre thick with hair and hide. And sometimes it was a life, still warm, still trembling, placed beside a ruler as a testament. Look, the burial said, this one commanded. This one was followed even into death. Royalty became sacred not through birth alone, but through what their deaths required, through the silence of others that wrapped around their memory. The gods of the Norse world were not soft. Odin, who gave his eye for wisdom, demanded sacrifice in return. Freyja, who chose among the dead, required beauty and boldness. Thor, protector and destroyer, watched over those who bled for their kin. These gods were not distant. They walked among men in saga and in story, but when it came to rituals, they were watchers, receivers, and they watched with open eyes. A body buried alive beneath a ship. This was not cruelty, but completion. A woman strangled in the black tent. Not punishment, but passage. The blood, the fire, the cries muffled beneath drums. These were not errors. They were instruments. The gods did not flinch from such gifts. They were built from them. And in return, it was believed, they gave. The land would bloom. The children would grow. The clan would win. A balance restored, at a price. And if that price was someone already owned, someone already used, someone who had never been free, then the gods would understand. This was the logic of offering, not random, not hidden. Entire communities watched the rituals, participated. The Volva named the chosen, the servants prepared the body, the tent was raised, the fire lit, and when the burial mound was sealed, it was not grief that remained. It was order, a statement to the divine. We did what was required. Now answer us. But the gods, like stone, did not reply. They received, they absorbed, they remained silent, and in that silence, power continued. Those who ruled in life extended their reach beyond death, and those sacrificed beside them were not remembered by name, but remembered as evidence that the gods had been pleased, that fate had been fed. Modern eyes may recoil from this, may search for meaning that softens the truth, but the bones do not lie. The placement, the posture, the tools of ritual found alongside the dead. These are messages sent upward, not to history, but to heaven. And they say this was not cruelty, it was faith. Faith in a world where death served the living. Faith in gods who demanded silence wrapped in blood. Faith that to give a life was to secure a future, and that obedience, even unto the grave, could echo into eternity. The gods did not answer, but they watched. With conversion came questions. Not at first. Not when the crosses were still carved in secret, not when the Gospels were still spoken in unfamiliar tongues. But slowly, as the north began to bend beneath a new sky, the gaze shifted. The rituals that had once been rooted in rhythm, season, and silence were now seen through foreign eyes. And those eyes did not look away. Christian monks came with scrolls, not swords. They arrived from the south and west, sent by kings or by callings, bearing ink and certainty. They saw the old ways as strange, as violent, and yet also as something hauntingly familiar. They witnessed the burning ships, the sacrifices, the songs that ended in silence, and they wrote, not always with truth, but always with reaction. Some were horrified. They saw the tent, they saw the girl led into it, they saw the blade, the priestess, the fire, and they called it barbarity, heathenry, a world untouched by grace. In their writings, the Norse became children of darkness, noble in form, but lost in spirit. Their rituals were framed as cruel, unredeemed. The cries of the sacrificed were cast as proof of a people who had not yet met God, and yet not all condemned. Some monks, shaped by their own traditions of martyrdom, of saints who bled willingly, who walked into fire for faith, saw in Viking sacrifice a strange mirror. A distortion, perhaps, but not an alien one. The slave girl who accepted her fate bore echoes of Christian martyrs who sang as they burned. The funeral pyres resembled the cleansing fire of relics. The Volva, chanting and choosing, reminded some of Sibyls, prophets, the mad wisdom of desert saints. This tension crept into the texts. Some accounts exaggerated, speaking of dozens sacrificed, of wild rites never found in archaeology. Others misunderstood, mistaking ritual for chaos, obedience for desire. But even the most biased chronicler could not fully dismiss what they had seen. The Viking ritual, with its silence and fire and blood, made its mark, and in that gaze, sharpened, unsettled, persistent, the ritual began to fray, not all at once, not in every fjord. But the pressure of the Christian world grew. As kings converted, so did their courts. As trade routes thickened, so did the presence of foreign gods. Crosses replaced hammers, psalms replaced runes, and the funeral sacrifice, once seen as sacred necessity, began to feel like something else, something watched, something questioned. The fear shifted. Once, it had been the fear of denying the old gods, of leaving the master to walk alone into the afterlife. Now, it became the fear of damnation, of punishment from a god who asked for mercy, not blood. Still, old habits die slowly. Even after conversion, echoes of the ritual remained, in the shape of the burial mounds, in the grave goods, in the stories told beside the hearth, but the core had changed. Fewer were killed, then none. The vulva faded, the tent collapsed. The silence no longer meant submission, it meant absence. And so, Viking ritual, once rooted in rhythm and fear, in structure and sacrifice, began to loosen its grip. The gods were no longer silent. They were replaced. The message once sent in fire and bone was now measured in prayer. But the memory remains. In the writings of monks who wrote too much or too little. In the bones that speak louder than the ink. In the tension between what was once believed and what was believed after belief changed. The Christian gaze arrived, and the North was never the same. Eventually, the screams faded. Not all at once, not like a door slamming shut, more like a breath that drew out longer each time, until none came at all. The great rituals, the black tents, the drums, the blades, once so vital to the rhythm of Norse death, began to falter. Not because the people no longer believed, but because the world around them began to look back, and in that gaze, something ancient began to flinch. The graves grew simpler. Once there had been ships buried beneath mounds as high as houses, filled with wealth and witnesses. Once there had been processions that wound through forests and over fields, people gathering to see who would die beside the dead. But then came the quiet reforms, the soft prayers in strange tongues, the crucifixes slipped into the hands of kings. Christian missionaries, scribes and soldiers did not always come with violence. They came with structure, and structure, in its own way, can be more final than force. Christian kings did not burn ships. They buried psalms. They wrapped the dead in cloth, not in silence. They placed crosses where runestones once stood. They outlawed the old sacrifices, not always with swords, but with laws. What had once been sacred, to send others into death with the powerful, was now called sin. A man who killed a servant for his burial no longer honored the gods. He defied the new one. But rituals do not end easily. They linger in corners, in whispers, in places far from courts and churches. In the edge villages, the cold farms, the hidden fjords where the sea still crashed the same way it always had, where belief held on like frost to stone. And somewhere, no one knows when, no one knows where, it happened one last time. One final ritual, one final servant chosen, one final scream folded into fire. There are no records of her name, no chronicle that names the fjord or the clan, no date carved on wood or stone, but history, when read carefully, leaves its shadows. A grave with strange layering, a body burned beside goods long out of fashion, a jawbone split not by war, but by panic. The archaeologist's brush trembles just slightly as it uncovers the moment. She did not go willingly. Not like the myths once claimed, not like the old songs suggested. There was no longer a vulva to chant her into calm, no crowd to witness her silence as sacred. Just a handful of those who still believed, desperate to keep the old ways alive. Perhaps a chieftain's son who clung to the rites of his father. Perhaps a family too afraid to bury their dead alone. They pulled the tent fabric tight. They lit the pyre quickly. They ended her quickly, or tried. And in the fire, sir, she screamed, not as ritual, not as rite, but as refusal. She screamed for herself, not for the gods who had long since turned their faces away, not for the dead beside her, who would not remember her name, but for her own breath, her own life, her own ending. And then, silence. Because after that scream, there were no more. The last priestess had long vanished. The last runes no longer carried power. And the gods, once watching with open eyes, were now replaced with one who asked for prayers, not pain. The silence that followed was not the same as peace. It was not healing, it was forgetting. And yet in that forgetting, something ended, something vast and terrible and deeply human, a world where obedience reached beyond the grave, a world where pain was shaped into prestige, a world where death followed command. The last slave who died screaming did not know she was the last. She only knew she was alone. And then she was gone, and in her place, a field overgrown, a grave unmapped, a silence that does not cry out, but still waits to be heard. Today, archaeologists unearth the bones. They kneel in fields once scorched by pyres, brush away centuries of soil with fingers and tools shaped for reverence. They do not arrive with answers, they arrive with patience, for the bones do not yield their stories all at once, and never without cost. Not with judgment, but with awe. They uncover not only what the Vikings built, but what they buried. A ship, its ribs still clinging to rusted nails, a comb carved from antler resting near a fractured skull, a bead, blue as winter glass, tucked beside the jawbone of someone who never spoke in any saga. Every object holds weight, not just in its form, but in its placement. Ritual, after all, was not random. It was script, and every burial was a scene carefully composed. Every chipped blade, every bent rib tells of grief and grandeur entwined. The grandeur, in the polished ornaments, the gleaming swords, the carved sleighs and spiraled brooches. These were not tools of war or vanity alone. They were legacy made material. They told the living and now tell us who this person was, or who they wanted to be remembered as. But beside them, grief. In the collapsed chest of a girl buried too soon, too near. In the bones that do not lie peacefully, but are twisted, clenched, interrupted. A shoulder dislocated not by accident, but by struggle. A wrist still bound in place by rusted rings of iron. These details were not meant to survive, but they have. We do not excavate only history. We exhume silence. And silence is not emptiness. It is memory unspoken. The silence of those who died in service, who are not mourned, only used. The silence of the priestess who chose, but was never named. The silence of the scream lost in the black tent, the fire, the drumbeat. This silence is heavy. It clings to the objects in the soil. It settles in the folds of burial cloth, in the creak of wooden boards pulled from beneath the moss. Modern science tries to listen. CT scans of bone, isotopic readings of hair, soil chemistry, DNA extraction, all done with care, with trembling sometimes. Because the deeper we look, the more we realize how much we do not know, and how much we fear what we might find. Because beneath that silence, we find the questions we are still afraid to ask. What does it mean to honor the dead? If the death itself was built on obedience, what kind of memory do we preserve when the body we celebrate rests beside one who was silenced? Can reverence exist beside erasure? And more. How much of this ritual was belief, and how much was power? How many said yes only because no was never an option? These are not questions for history alone. They echo forward. They ask us not only to remember, but to feel the weight of a broken rib beneath the gold, to feel the silence between the figures in the burial mound, to feel the difference between who was sent and who was taken. Today, archaeologists work in teams. They document, preserve, translate. They step carefully around graves once meant to be permanent. And in that work, they are not merely digging. They are listening to a world that buried its truths alongside its rulers, listening to bones that outlive the gods they died for, listening to a silence shaped by ritual, but shattered now by memory. We thought we were uncovering the past, but in the end, the past is uncovering us. These rituals are not preserved in museums, not fully, not comfortably. A ship stands behind glass, its ribs polished and lit with reverence. A brooch glints beneath the eye of 1,000 tourists. A loom weight, a bone comb, a reconstructed tapestry frayed at the edges. These are fragments, curated, catalogued, and quiet. But what is missing cannot be placed in a display case. What is missing is the silence between these objects, the breath that never reached the end of a scream, the eyes that were closed not by peace but by obedience. Museums tell stories, but they do not always tell the whole one, because some stories do not fit on placards. Some stories do not soothe. Some cannot be translated into heritage or heritage sites. They live in side notes, in footnotes, in the uneasy language of archaeological reports. Secondary burial, possible trauma, non-local female, high strontium variability. A life reduced to distance, a death reduced to data. History did not forget. It simply stopped looking. For centuries, the grandeur of Viking burials captivated the imagination, the ships, the swords, the sagas. The kings who ruled the sea, the queens who spun fate, the fire that turned bodies into myth. These were the tales retold, the objects displayed. But beside every ruler buried in honor, there was someone buried in silence. And those were not the stories that made it into the grand exhibitions. Those were the stories that slipped through. But memory remains. Not in statues, not in song, but in bone. In every rib cracked beneath the weight of earth. In every jaw frozen open in a final breath. In every burial where one body is celebrated and another is merely present. In ships, in grave goods arranged with too much symmetry. In limbs positioned without grace. In hands folded across chests that once resisted. The earth does not forget what it held. Archaeologists are learning to listen, not just to what is preserved, but to what resists preservation, the curve of a spine too tight, the absence of weapons in a warrior's pose, the presence of jewelry on a wrist still shackled. These details do not shout, but they do not lie. They murmur through the centuries, not as accusations, but as truths that were never allowed to be truths. And in that murmur is the line we are only now learning to follow. In every whisper that says, "Not all were willing," there is no monument for the sacrificed, no national day, no preserved voice. But they remain, not in memory as we often define it, but in something older, something quieter, something heavier. Memory here is not a song or story. It is an unmarked grave. It is the space between honor and obedience, between myth and silence, between the body we display and the one we never ask about. And in that space, something sacred still waits, not to be forgiven, but simply to be known. They were called kings and queens, figures of glory, of command, of songs sung across fjords and centuries. Their names, when known, are carved into rune stones, spoken in sagas, reconstructed in exhibitions lined with glass and light. They ruled not only land, but endings, not only lives, but how those lives were remembered. And yet their legacy is not only gold, not only swords gilded with serpents or brooches shaped like suns. Their legacy is also found in the shadows of their graves, in the quiet spaces where no name was recorded and no honor was given. It is in the women who never left the tent, who were dressed in silk not for celebration, but for submission, who drank until they could no longer stand, were held down while drums drowned out their refusal, and entered the grave beside their mistress, not as equals, but as evidence. It is in the slaves who breathe their last beneath bone beams, laid in the hulls of ships built for someone else's eternity, buried alive, perhaps, or strangled with care. Their ribs broken, not in war, but in ritual. Their silence wrapped in cloth and never mentioned again. The royals are remembered, their images reconstructed, their belongings studied, their death rites described as magnificent, complex, sacred. And they were, but they were also violent. And that violence was not abstract, it was intimate, it was directed, it was chosen, and those buried with them, the concubine, the servant, the child who never grew old, they are the reason we still tell this story, because without them, the grandeur collapses. Without their silence, the ritual falters. Without their presence, the memory of power loses its shape. These were not just accessories to legacy, they were the legacy. Proof that the king ruled not just in life, but into death. That the queen commanded not just loyalty, but surrender. That belief was not only practiced, it was enforced. And so now, centuries later, when we step into the echoing stillness of a burial chamber, when we peer into glass cases holding twisted beads and ash-darkened bone, when we run our fingers along the carvings left behind, we are not only looking at royalty, we are looking at what royalty required. And it is in that requirement, that demand, that silence, that sacrifice, that the story holds its weight, because greatness was never buried alone. And the story survives, not because the kings did, not because the queens did, but because those buried with them still whisper, even now,